Good morning, everybody. Chester ARP Church Devotional Podcast, Romans chapter 10. Here we go. All right. Well, thank you so much for being with us this morning. We will get started in Romans chapter 10. Just a few verses again that we looked at yesterday at the end of chapter 9, beginning of chapter 10. We'll connect the dots between the two. Again, just 4 verses this morning. Here we go. I don't want to be bogged down, but I think sometimes it's important to address these specific issues. Verse 1 of chapter 10. Brothers, that's a generic term, brothers and sisters, my heart's desire and prayer to God for them, that's for the Jews, is that they may be saved. For I bear them witness that they have a zeal for God, but not according to knowledge. For being ignorant of the righteousness of God, and seeking to establish their own way, they did not submit to God's righteousness. For Christ is the end of the law for righteousness for everyone who believes. Now here's the thing. Yesterday, if you were with us, we talked about the end of Romans chapter 9, how Paul says that the Gentiles are saved by faith. The Jews are not saved by their works. They are saved by faith as well. It's all about faith, the importance of trusting in Jesus and finding our righteousness in Him, our hope of eternity in Him. Now we turn our attention to the beginning of chapter 10 now, and Paul continues that explanation. And he basically says, my heart's desire and prayer to God for the Jews is that they may be saved. Paul, if you remember back at the beginning of chapter 9, if you were listening at that time, in the beginning of chapter 9, Paul says, I'd give it all up for the sake of the Jews. He wants people to come to know Jesus as Lord. There's no question about that. And so he says, I would go take, hell myself. I would take judgment myself in order for the Jews to be saved by the grace and mercy of God. He says in verse 2, they have a tremendous zeal for God. No questions about it. If you read the gospel story in the Bible, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, they have a zeal for God. Religious people have zeal for God. A lot of times, especially in the context of Jews and Christian faith, religious people have zeal for God. They do what they do because they have a tremendous amount of zeal for God. But yet, it's not according to knowledge. It's not that they don't know Him. They don't have the faith to trust Him. They don't have the knowledge that comes through faith in this Word. And so they do it to please Him, but they don't know Him. To know Him means that you know that He wants your heart. He wants your faith. He wants you to give yourself to Him, and that we receive His gifts of grace by faith. He says they're ignorant of the righteousness of God. They seek to establish their own. That's fundamentally what it means when we try to make ourselves right before God. We try to do it ourselves. We try to make sure that we can be good enough or somehow be considered worthy. All we're doing is trying to make ourselves righteous. We're trying to do it on our own. We're trying to establish our own good fortune, our own good righteousness before God, and to make ourselves look better. And he says, listen, that's not what it's about. It's about trusting God for His righteousness, for His gift of grace, making us right before His presence, cleansing us, forgiving us, giving us hope, giving us life. And then he goes on to says, they did not submit to God's righteousness. You see, why is faith so important? Why is it so important that we pause and make sure we're trusting God for His gifts of grace and for Him making us right before His presence? Why is it so important that faith? Well, one, that's how we receive it, God says. But two, faith is a submission to God. You see, the Christian life and really salvation itself, but the Christian life as well, is about submission. It's about submitting to God and trusting Him. And so when we think about, when it comes to these contexts of, do we rest in the righteousness that Jesus won for us on the cross? In other words, Jesus was perfect on our behalf. He died a perfect death in our place, took our wrath upon Himself. When we rest in that and we trust Him for that, we're submitting to God's will for our lives. Faith is about submission. Following Jesus is about submission. Salvation is about submission, saying, I can't do it myself. I'm going to trust You to do it for me. I'm going to submit myself to You. He says in verse 4, for Christ is the end of the law for righteousness for everyone who believes. And so when we believe in Jesus, He is the end, the ultimate end of life. Our ultimate desire is to praise Him, to glorify Him, to submit to Him. And so when we trust Jesus, we don't obey the law in order to make ourselves better or look better or make ourselves appear better before God. What we do is we trust Jesus. We receive the gift of his grace where he did it on our behalf, and then we seek to follow him as we want to honor him for his great gift of grace and his worth in the world. And so faith is all about submission. If you're trying to do it on your own, you're not submitting to God. It's about submitting to God. Your will is best. Your way is best. I'm going to trust you with my life, and I'm going to follow your way and your will for my life. That's what it's all about. It's about submission. Hope you guys have a good day. God bless you. Try to go forward in faith, but also submission to God as you walk with him. See you soon.